It's 11:47 at night. You're not doing anything productive. You're just lying there, phone tilted over your face, scrolling the same 5 accounts you always scroll. And then it happens. Someone posts a screenshot. 6 figures in a trading app. Caption says something like, "Made this in 3 weeks." And for a second, something in your chest just tightens. It's not jealousy, exactly. It's quieter than that. More like a low hum in the back of your mind going, wait, am I doing this wrong? Everyone else seems to have found some shortcut you missed the memo on. Meanwhile, you've got $200 that gets pulled out of your paycheck automatically every month into something you honestly don't think about much anymore. No screenshot, no caption, nothing to show anybody. So here's what I want you to sit with for the next 20 minutes or so. What if the thing you're already quietly doing, the thing that feels too slow and too small, and honestly kind of boring, is the exact thing that actually works? And what if the exciting stuff, the stuff that racks up the likes, is usually the stuff that quietly wrecks people? That's really what this video is about. Not another list of tips, just an honest look at why boring wins, and why almost nobody believes that until they've lived through it themselves. Okay, let's start with something most people don't love admitting. Building wealth isn't actually that complicated intellectually. Hand the average stressed-out person a whiteboard and 30 minutes, and they could sketch out the basic idea without much help. Spend less than you make. Save some of it. Put it somewhere reasonable. Leave it alone. Do that for a long time. So it's not really a knowledge problem. If it were, personal finance books would have solved this decades ago. Which raises the obvious question. Why does it still feel so hard? Why do genuinely smart people, people who are disciplined about basically everything else in their life, still end up stressed about money or living paycheck to paycheck, even on a decent income? Because the plan was never the hard part. Living inside your own head, while you try to actually follow the plan, that's the hard part. Think about what boring is really asking of you. It's asking you to do the same unremarkable thing, month after month, year after year, with almost nothing to show for it in the short run. No scoreboard lighting up, no little ping of reward. Your balance moves a few dollars, and then it just sits there, looking almost exactly like it did last month. And your brain, the same brain that evolved to notice threats and rewards fast, looks at that non-event and quietly decides nothing is happening, which makes the exciting alternative, the fast version, the one with visible drama, start to look like the smarter move. I want to be clear about something here, because it matters. This isn't a willpower problem, and it definitely isn't a character flaw. A lot of financial content kind of low-key blames people for this. Like, if you just tried harder, you wouldn't feel the pull toward the exciting stuff. That's not fair. And honestly, it's not even true. Your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. The problem is that the world it was built for, and the world your money actually lives in now, are two completely different games. And a lot of us never really watched the boring version get modeled for us growing up either. Maybe money in your house showed up mostly in arguments, or in silence, or in a kind of forced cheerfulness that hid how tight things actually were behind the scenes. Nobody sat you down and walked you through what a calm, unremarkable relationship with money even looks like. Mostly because the adults around you were figuring it out as they went too. So if the boring approach feels foreign, almost uncomfortable to you, that doesn't mean you're behind. It just means you didn't get many examples of it. It's a skill, like anything else. Nobody's born already knowing it. So let's actually get into what's happening underneath all this. Because once you see it, it's hard to unsee. There's a concept in behavioral psychology called hyperbolic discounting. All it really means is that people are wired to value a smaller reward right now over a much bigger reward later, even when the math clearly says, wait. And it's not because we're bad at math. It's because right now feels more real to us than later does. The future version of you, the one with a fully funded retirement account, doesn't feel very real emotionally. Not compared to the version of you standing in line right now, trying to decide between the $4 coffee and the $7 one. Now, take that wiring and drop it into a financial world that's basically built around exploiting it. Every app that touches your money, trading platforms, shopping apps, sometimes even your banking app, is designed by people who understand this bias really, really well. A red notification, a countdown timer, a little animation when your balance ticks up. All of that creates a feeling of progress and reward, way more effectively than actual long-term progress ever does, which leads to this strange situation where the apps rewarding your brain the most are often the ones building your wealth the least. And the stuff that feels like nothing is happening, a plain index fund just sitting there in a retirement account, is usually the thing doing all the actual heavy lifting. Here's a simple way to picture it. Say you put $200 a month into a broad, low-cost index fund, starting at 25. Nothing fancy, no timing the market, no chasing whatever sector's hot, just $200, automatically, every month. Assuming something like an average 8% return over time, which is roughly in line with long-run historical averages. Though, of course, no future return is ever guaranteed. By the time you hit 55, that forgettable little habit has quietly turned into something in the neighborhood of $300,000. Nobody claps for that. There was no dramatic month in there anywhere. Nothing worth screenshotting. Just 30 years of a decision so ordinary, you genuinely have a hard time remembering when you even made it. Now compare that to the exciting version. Someone spends those same 30 years chasing the bigger highs, moving money around based on headlines, jumping into whatever's trending, paying fees and taxes on all that movement, occasionally winning big enough to talk about it, and quietly never bringing up the losses. On paper, both people had access to roughly the same amount of money, but one of them was fighting their own psychology every single step of the way, and the other basically removed the fight entirely by making the decision once, calmly, and letting time handle the rest. And this is the part almost everyone misses. Compound growth doesn't reward intensity. It rewards consistency and time. Money left alone to grow at a steady rate behaves a lot like a snowball rolling downhill. In the first few years, it looks kind of pathetic. Honestly, barely moving at all. You'd be forgiven for assuming it isn't working. But growth is quietly stacking on top of growth in the background. And the curve doesn't really start to feel dramatic until you're deep into it. Usually somewhere past year 15 or 20, which, not coincidentally, is exactly the point where most people have already given up, because they judged the whole method back in year 2, when it was still supposed to look boring. There's a social piece of this too that doesn't get talked about enough. We're all constantly comparing our behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel. And nowhere is that more true than with money. Somebody posting a big win isn't going to mention the 4 losses that came before it. Somebody showing off a new car isn't going to mention the interest rate on the loan or how tight things get right before payday. Meanwhile, your own boring progress, the fact that you didn't touch your emergency fund this month, The fact that your investment account contributed on its own without you even opening the app. That stuff is invisible, by design. It's not exciting enough to post. So the only version of financial life you keep seeing online is the loud, risky, occasionally lucky one. Of course, it starts to feel like everyone else is in on some secret you missed. They're not. Most of them are one bad month away from a very different story. Let's talk about emergency funds for a second, because I honestly think this might be the most underrated boring habit that exists. An emergency fund isn't exciting. It's money sitting in a plain savings account, earning next to nothing, just waiting around for a car repair or a medical bill or a slow month at work. On paper, it can feel like wasted potential. Shouldn't that money be invested instead? Growing somewhere? Here's why that framing misses something important. The real value of an emergency fund isn't the interest it earns. It's the decisions it keeps you from having to make while you're panicking. Without one, a $500 surprise doesn't just cost you $500. It costs you a credit card balance that lingers for months, plus the interest on top, plus that low-grade anxiety that follows you around every time you glance at your account. With one, that same surprise costs you exactly $500 and a slightly less padded cushion. That's it. That's the whole difference. But emotionally, that difference is enormous. Even though the dollar amount barely moved, there is another version of this that shows up less in investing apps and more in ordinary, everyday life. And once you name it, almost everyone recognizes it instantly. Picture two friends who get the exact same raise at work. One of them lets their spending quietly creep up to match it. A slightly nicer apartment, a slightly newer car, food delivery, a couple more nights a week, small upgrades that each feel completely reasonable on their own. The other friend takes that same raise and redirects most of it into savings and investing before it ever really touches their day-to-day life. So their spending barely moves at all. A year later, neither one of them would say their life looks dramatically different. The first friend doesn't feel rich. They just feel like they're living a slightly nicer version of before. And somehow, they're still just as tight by the end of every month. The second friend doesn't feel deprived either, since nothing about their daily life actually shrank. But 5 years out, one of them has built real breathing room, and the other is earning noticeably more than they used to, and still living paycheck to paycheck, just at a higher altitude. That gap was never really about income. It was about which raises got quietly absorbed into lifestyle, and which ones got quietly redirected before there was time to get used to spending them. Debt runs on that same quiet logic, just pointed the other way. Paying a credit card balance down a little faster than the minimum isn't exciting. There's no milestone graphic for it, but high-interest debt is basically compounding, working against you instead of for you. And every extra dollar you throw at it early is a dollar that stops multiplying against your future self. It's the same principle as investing, just aimed backward, which is part of why it deserves that same patient, boring attention, instead of being treated like an emergency to panic about, or worse, an afterthought to ignore completely. This really is the heart of why boring habits work. They're not designed to impress anyone. They're designed to keep your future self out of situations where panic ends up calling the shots instead of judgment. So here's the shift I want to offer you, and it's less a tip and more just A different way of seeing the whole picture. Boring isn't the absence of a strategy. Boring is the strategy. The habits that feel too small to matter. The automatic transfer, the extra payment toward debt, the fund you never touch, aren't placeholder moves while you wait around for a better plan to come along. They already are the plan. They're just running on a timeline that doesn't match your nervous system's appetite for proof. Once that actually sinks in, something shifts in how you make decisions. You stop needing every financial choice to feel thrilling. Before you'll trust it's working, you stop checking your account 5 times a day, hunting for some sign that things are fine, because you've finally internalized that the sign was never going to show up daily. It shows up over years. You start measuring progress, less by how it feels this week, and more by whether the underlying system, the quiet habits humming along in the background, is still intact. This is where money stops being purely a math problem and starts being more of a peace of mind problem. Because honestly, the real goal underneath most of this was never just have more money as some abstract number. It was always something closer to stop feeling like I'm one bad week away from disaster. Stop doing anxious math in my head at 2 in the morning. Have enough room to breathe. That a decision can come from a calm place instead of a scared one. Boring habits deliver that feeling precisely because they don't depend on you being disciplined or motivated or lucky on any particular day. They just keep running quietly, whether you're thinking about them or not. So what does this actually look like in real life without turning into some rigid system you'll abandon in 3 weeks? It starts with automating the boring part so it stops depending on your willpower at all. The second a habit requires you to remember it, decide on it, and feel motivated about it. Every single time, it becomes fragile. But if the transfer to savings or the contribution to your retirement account happens the same day your paycheck lands, before that money ever really shows up in your checking account, you've basically removed the daily argument with yourself. You're not relying on future you to make the right call under temptation anymore. Present you already made that call once, calmly, and now it just repeats on its own. It also means giving yourself permission to build an emergency fund, slowly, without treating it like some kind of race. Even a small starter cushion, enough to cover a car repair or a missed shift, changes the emotional texture of financial stress. You don't need 6 months saved up to feel the benefit. You just need enough that the next surprise doesn't automatically turn into a crisis. If your job offers any kind of retirement match, that's about as close to boring free money as it gets. And it's worth actually understanding what's on the table, because leaving a match unclaimed is quietly one of the more expensive, boring mistakes out there. The kind that costs you nothing today and a real amount over time, silently, in the background, where you'll never notice it happening. It also means resisting the urge to check your investments constantly. In the short term, markets are noisy and mostly meaningless, day to day. And watching that noise trains your brain to react to fluctuations that have nothing to do with your actual long-term outcome. A monthly glance, or honestly, even less than that, protects you from yourself way more than checking daily ever will. And maybe most importantly, it means getting comfortable with the fact that your version of progress is going to look uneventful from the outside. There's no dramatic reveal coming. Nobody's going to look at your bank statement and be impressed by a normal Tuesday where nothing happened except a scheduled transfer going through exactly like it did last month. That's not a sign. You're doing it wrong. That's what it's supposed to look like while it's working. It also helps to plan for the expenses that aren't monthly, but are still completely predictable. Car maintenance, holiday spending, an annual insurance premium, a birthday that somehow sneaks up on you every year, despite happening on the exact same day. Setting aside a small, boring amount toward these ahead of time means they stop feeling like emergencies when they show up, even though, deep down, you basically knew they were coming the whole time, and every few months, it's worth taking one quiet look at where money's leaking out in ways that don't really serve you anymore. Not a harsh audit, just an honest glance, a subscription that renewed automatically for something you stopped using ages ago, a plan you upgraded once and never bothered downgrading back. None of this is about deprivation. It's just closing small, forgotten leaks, so the boring system underneath keeps running the way it's supposed to, instead of quietly losing a little water. Nobody's watching. None of this asks for extreme sacrifice or cutting every small joy out of your life. It's not about never buying the coffee or never going out with friends. It's about making sure the boring, structural stuff is running quietly underneath everything else. So those small joys don't come with a hidden cost. You won't notice until later. If there's one thing I hope sticks with you after all this, it's a little more patience with wherever you happen to be right now. Maybe you're just starting out. Maybe your automatic transfer is only $50, and some part of you feels almost embarrassed by how small that looks next to whatever you saw online earlier. I want you to know that $50 done quietly and consistently for years stops looking like $50 eventually. It turns into a decade of a calmer version of you, making that same unremarkable decision over and over. And then one day, just noticing, the account looks completely different than you remember. You're not behind because your progress feels invisible right now. Almost everyone's early progress is invisible. That's not a flaw in the plan. That's simply what the beginning of compounding looks like for pretty much everyone who's ever pulled this off, whether they ever talk about it or not. So next time you catch something loud and impressive scroll by, and that familiar tightness shows up in your chest again, I want you to remember tonight. Remember that the boring transfer you barely even notice anymore is doing more for your future than almost anything you could ever post about. Let it stay boring. Let it stay quiet. That's not it failing. That's just the sound of it working. Progress doesn't have to be dramatic to be real. It just has to keep happening.